But here comes the shocker. Kasparov simply gave a rook for that bishop, and after knight takes b7, white is a full exchange down with no clear compensation at first sight. Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to see one of the most amazing exchange sacrifices that I've ever come across. And this sacrifice was played by former world champion Garry Kasparov, who was known for being a great tactician, a very aggressive player. But the sacrifice that we see here is going to be a very deep strategic sacrifice. So let's get started with the game. Here Kasparov went e4, and after c5 we get a Sicilian defense, knight to f3, e6. Here both white and black have a lot of options. d6 is another very common idea, but e6 is still very common. And after d4, pawn takes and knight takes, knight to f6, develops and attacks the pawn. Here white went knight to c3. I'm not going to focus a lot on the opening, but I will show you some tricks that you should be aware of if you play the Sicilian defense. Here the move e5 is actually very bad. It might look tempting to attack the knight, but here after queen to a5 we get a fork, so black is attacking the king and the pawn and winning the pawn on e5. So Kasparov developed with knight to c3, and here black went knight to c6, which leads the game to the 4 knights variation in the Sicilian defense. Again here white has many options. Knight d to b5 is a very common move. It has a very concrete idea of going knight to d6. So black here prevented that with the move d6, which is very logical. Just want to mention a few alternatives. Bishop to b4 is commonly played here, but a move that you should be careful about not to play if you play as black is the move d5. So here the move d5 might look tempting, but this is a very serious mistake, because after white takes on d5 and pawn takes, here white has two very strong alternatives. One of them is to go bishop to f4, planning to go knight to c7. Or here there's a very common tactic that can be played in different openings, which is that white can actually take this pawn on d5. So after knight takes and knight takes, white has this very nice move, queen takes d5, sacrificing the queen. But the point is that after queen takes d5 and knight to c7, white is forking the king and the queen, so white is recovering the queen and ending up having an extra pawn and a better position. So d6 makes a lot of sense, and here white in a way has to justify this idea of knight to b5, because otherwise white is wasting time. That's why here the follow-up is bishop to f4, putting more pressure on d6, and here black is pretty much forced to play the move e5 as was played in the game. So black has to defend this pawn on d6. Knight to e5 might look like an alternative, but here white has a very strong move, which is the move queen to d4, planning to castle long or to go rook to d1, putting more pressure on d6. And here black is no time to kick away the knight, because after a6, here white could even castle long and then plan to take on e5, but even the simple knight takes d6 here is very strong, because after bishop takes or queen takes, white takes on e5 and wins the pawn in all this sequence. So e5 is the logical move. Now white doesn't have any threats on d6. e5 also controls the d4 square, but after bishop to g5, there's a general drawback with this idea of going e5 in the Sicilian defense, which is that the d5 square has become weakened, which as we'll see is going to be very important in this game. In any case, so far, these moves have been played in a lot of games. After a6, now the knight has to go back to a3, and after b5, even though white gets the d5 square, this knight on a3 is misplaced. Now there's even the idea to go b4, forking the two knights. So white goes knight to d5, pinning the knight. Taking on f6 was another option, but knight to d5 is very common. And after bishop to e7, white takes on f6, this is very common, removing the knight on f6, which was controlling d5. And here bishop takes is the most logical follow-up, trying to activate this bishop. Later on, bishop to g5 might be an idea. And here white has two main options, either to go c3 or c4. Kasparov went c3. The main idea is to reroute the knight via c2. And in this position, which has been reached in many games, black normally castles short or goes bishop to g5. These are just common ideas in the position. Knight to e7 is another common idea to challenge this knight on d5. But here Shirov went bishop to b7, which is not that common. In a way it makes sense because it develops the bishop, but on the other hand the knight is blocking the bishop on b7, so black will sooner or later move this knight on c6, otherwise the bishop on b7 is not doing anything. So Kasparov went knight to c2, and here Shirov went knight to b8. Knight to e7 was another common and probably more natural move, even though knight to b8 makes sense because the idea of knight to b8 is to bring the knight to d7, but black is wasting time this way, but the knight on d7 is going to be better placed than on c6. And here we see another idea of bringing the knight to c2, that now white can go a4, challenging this annoying pawn on b5, and after pawn takes and rook takes, black went knight to d7. By the way, here taking on d5 might be an idea in some positions, but not here because after bishop takes, white still wants to control the d5 square, so not take with the pawn, but white here can take with the queen, and this queen is actually well placed so far. Black cannot challenge it easily. It is now attacking the rook on a8, and white also has some pressure on a6. White has great control of the light squares, so this is already very good for white. So here Shirov went knight to d7, and here there might be ideas to go knight to c5, attacking the rook and the pawn. Knight to b6 might be an idea sometimes to try to challenge this very strong knight on d5. And here white could have anticipated this idea, for example go rook to a2, but Kasparov, he's a very concrete and aggressive player. Here he played the move rook to b4, attacking the bishop on b7. And in hindsight here, black could have tried something like rook to a7, just defending that bishop, and sooner or later black might have ideas to attack this rook on b4, so even though this rook is quite active, it can be attacked. So this was an alternative, but the move that Shirov played was a lot more natural. Here he went knight to c5. The whole idea of bringing the knight to d7 was to improve the knight, so knight to c5 makes a lot of sense. It defends the bishop. The knight here is very well placed, it cannot be challenged. But here comes the shocker. Kasparov simply gave a rook for that bishop, and after knight takes b7, white is a full exchange down with no clear compensation at first sight. But let's see the follow-up to try to understand this very deep exchange sacrifice. So here the follow-up was to go b4. And first of all, let's look at this knight on b7. It literally doesn't have any squares to go. a5 and c5 are controlled by the b4 pawn, and it cannot go to d8. So at least for the time being, this knight on b7 is really bad. And as we discussed before, this knight on d5 is a very strong piece which cannot be challenged easily, and white can reinforce that knight, for example by bringing another knight to e3. So white has this monster knight on d5, but on the other hand, black might try to open lines for his rooks, which is something that will happen in just a few moves. So here black followed up with the move bishop to g5, improving that bishop. Black might also want to take on e3 if white brings a knight to e3. That's why Kasparov went knight to a3, which might look paradoxical because the knight from a3 went to c2, but now the knight wants to go to c4. Now we have a completely different position after the exchange sacrifice, so white is just readapting his plans. So here black castled, and after knight to c4, black went a5, which makes a lot of sense. The pawn a6 might be a target, so now black wants to trade pawns and even open the a file for the rook. Here white went bishop to d3, planning to castle, and in this position black took on b4, which makes sense. If black goes a4, generally speaking, black wants to open files for the rooks, but here there's also a simple fork after knight c to b6. White is just attacking the rook on the pawn, so this pawn is going to fall. So black took on b4, and after pawn takes, let's reevaluate the position because there was a change after we got this trade. So now white has a pass pawn on the b file, and this pawn on d6 is actually not great. It feels as if white is playing with an extra pawn because this pawn is just blocked by the knight on d5. So white has a very strong pass pawn against this pawn on d6, which might be a target. So this is another compensation that white has in this position. As we discussed, white has very strong knights, and this bishop might get active. For example, if white goes knight c to b6, the bishop might go to c4, so white has great control of the light squares. So all in all, white has a very good position, and it is actually even black the one who has to be careful. Now there's another annoying thing for black. So black would love to activate the knight, for example bring it to d8, and for that the queen has to move, but the queen doesn't have a lot of squares to go. For example, if the queen goes to c8, then white gets this fork and gets the material back. So here black tried queen to b8. And as we'll see, evaluating these positions can get quite complex because you need a very strong strategic understanding for that. And before we move on with the rest of the game, I have a very important announcement. I just launched my complete course about chess strategy that will teach you a very concrete method to evaluate any position strategically. And for the next few days only, I'll be providing massive offers, so feel free to check the link in the description if you want to know more about this. So here black tried queen to b8, and here Kasparov played a very subtle move h4. The bishop is actually active on this diagonal and this diagonal as well, so white is attacking the bishop and after the bishop moves, now some important squares around black's king are not going to be covered. So here Kasparov continued with knight c to b6, just improving his pieces. White simply has better pieces, even though they are nominally worth less, they are much better here. Now there's also a concrete idea, not only attacking the rook on a8, but also planning to go knight to d7, forking the queen and the rook. But Shirov tried to complicate the game after rook to a2, now bishop to d2, giving a check might be an idea. That's why Kasparov castled, and after rook to d2 and queen to f3, this rook might look nice on d2, but it is not doing a lot. Here Shirov went queen to a7, and now Kasparov went knight to d7, attacking the rook. Now here black might have some resources, but at least for a human in a game, this position is already looking very ugly. Even though it might seem like the rook has a lot of squares, it doesn't. For example, if the rook goes to c8, here we get a fork. Rook to c8 would be a logical way to try to activate the rook, but here white simply picks up a full rook. There's also an idea that after the rook moves, knight to e7 and queen takes f7 is going to be in the air. There might also be some ideas to sacrifice a knight on f6 to attack the king. That's why here Shirov tried knight to d8, which from a general point of view might make sense, give some material back, and then try to activate the knight, for example bring it to e6 and then to d4, but unfortunately for black, he's not going to be in time for that, because Kasparov played very accurately. Here he took on f8, and after king takes, now he went b5, so now we see that this pawn on the b file is becoming stronger, b6 might be an idea. Here Shirov tried queen to a3, and this was a very interesting move, but again Kasparov played a brilliant game. Here he went queen to f5. The idea is that after the bishop moves, for example to c4, black can trade queens and then try to bring the rook down. We have opposite color bishops, so black has chances to defend this position. But Kasparov played the very nice queen to f5, attacking the pawn h7 and also planning to go queen to d7, so black is in no time to take the bishop on d3. For example, after queen takes, queen to d7 is just very strong. There's ideas to go queen to d7, queen to e7, so black might even get checkmated here. So Shirov tried king to e8, but the king already looks very awkward here. Kasparov simply went bishop to c4, and after rook to c2, again Kasparov, he's a very strong tactical player. Besides playing a strategic masterpiece as he did in this game, his tactics were really strong here. Kasparov didn't move the bishop, he took the pawn h7, and the idea is that after rook takes, as it was played in the game, white simply gets a fork after queen to g8, king to d7, and knight to b6. So white is collecting the rook on c4, king to e7, knight takes. Again, the game is pretty much over, but Shirov tried to complicate the game by going queen to c5. Kasparov played the sharpest moves, as he very often did. Rook to a1. The idea is to go rook to a7 if black takes on c4. So after queen takes and rook to a7, white gives a check and then would collect the knight on d8. And after queen to d4, rook to a3 and bishop to c1, Kasparov played another very nice move, knight to e3. Again, highlighting the weaknesses of the light squares. So here there's ideas to go either knight to d5 or knight to f5. And in this position, Shirov resigned. He's no time to take the rook because after knight to f5, we get a fork and white is winning the queen. So this was a very deep exchange sacrifice, where at first sight, black's position looks good, but in a practical game, black's position was very hard to play with that very passive knight on b7 and his rooks that could not coordinate well throughout the game. So I hope that you enjoyed the game, thanks a lot for watching and I'll see you in the next video.